The U.S. has the largest, criminal legal system in the world. We have the largest prison system in the world. We incarcerate the highest percentage of our population in the world. So our system is massive and unrivaled. And without plea bargaining, the whole system would grind to a halt, because it's not in my client's best interest that the prosecution's angry and wants to fight and keep fighting while my client sits in prison.
Testimony continued today in the most notorious criminal trial in Richland County history. Dr. John Boyle is accused of killing his wife Maureen and burying her body in the basement of his new home in Erie, Pennsylvania.
The 12-year-old son finally took the stand.
As I heard a scream, I heard a thud. It was about this loud.
We, the jury, find the defendant guilty.
When I was 12 years old, my testimony sent my father to prison for murdering my mother. This podcast serves as a type of therapy and reconciliation for myself, and it is my hope that it helps anyone who has experienced deception, betrayal, and dark trauma. I'm Collier Landry, and this is Moving Past Trauma. Hey movers, welcome back to another episode of Moving Past Trauma. I'm your host, Collier Landry, and what's going on? I'm really excited today. I have a great guest for you guys. Justin Brooks, who is the head of the California Innocence Project. He is a lawyer, obviously, and a professor as well. He is the author of the book, You Might Go to Prison Even If You're Innocent. So I'm really pleased to have Justin as a part of the program. We have, he has shared with me a lot about his story. He's exonerated, I believe, 38, almost 39 people so far with his work, pro bono work, and work that he's done to really help exonerate people who have been incarcerated for quite a long time. So I'm pleased to welcome Justin Brooks to the program.
Thank you.
Hey, Justin, how are you, man?
I'm great. It's great to be with you.
Did I butcher that, or was I?
No, you were right on the numbers. We walked 39 innocent people out of prison. I'm hoping number 40 is going to be in the next couple of weeks.
Oh wow, number 40. There you go. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about you, how you came into this work, what you've been doing, all of that fun stuff.
So when I got out of law school, I was a regular criminal defense attorney for a while, and then I went into academia. I was teaching at a law school in Michigan. And I heard about a woman on death row in Chicago who was sentenced to death on a plea bargain. And that troubled me deeply, that someone could be sentenced to death on a bargain. And so I met with her, and she actually told me that she was factually innocent. And that led to me talking to my students about it, saying, this very young person, she was 21 years old, is scheduled to be executed. She says she's innocent. And we started investigating her case and found out that she was, in fact, innocent. And that case kind of changed my life. I decided to devote the rest of my career to innocence work. I moved to California, started the California Innocence Project. And for the past 25 years, that's what I've been doing, is getting innocent people out of prison.
Some people I've gone back and forth with, because it is my understanding that with the way that the court systems are set up now, and with the overload, and then, of course, we have the sort of the hangover from COVID and things of that nature. Most convictions are done through a plea bargain. Is that correct?
98% now.
98%. I had said 90% to this person, and they were like, "That's not right." They worked in the prosecuting office in Orange County, California, and I was like, "Oh, okay." I was like, "Well, then that must be the wrong information that I have," but clearly it's 98%.
Yeah, I just read that recently that it had gone up. It was 92 to 94%. You'd see stats for a long time. But yeah, almost every case is resolved by plea bargain. And we've really become a system of pleas. The Supreme Court, in fact, recently said that in a case. They were talking about whether they should apply the right to effective lawyers to plea bargaining. And the court said, it's a system of pleas. Of course we have to do that. Otherwise, you don't get a good lawyer to negotiate that deal. And that's part of what you need a good lawyer for.
The Sixth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution guarantees everybody the right to a fair and speedy trial, correct?
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't really work that way.
Well, I guess it depends on your definitions of fair and speedy. But the Supreme Court also has never defined for the states any specific number of what it means to be a speedy trial. In the federal system, there's specific days and deadlines. But the problem in the federal system, if they don't meet those deadlines, your case gets dismissed without prejudice, meaning it can be refiled. So it doesn't really stop the government from coming back at you. It just kind of kicks the case out for a little bit. So there's, what speedy means. Speedy means different things to different people.
Everyone basically said, and I believe there's been a documentary 13th, I think, that came out that highlighted this, that if everyone decided to say, okay, I want a jury trial, I want the right to this, that the court system would just bottleneck and would just be frozen, essentially. Correct?
That's correct. And that's in fact happened a few times where sort of public defender's office in protest will just file all their cases for trial, knowing that the system can't possibly sustain it. The U.S. has the largest, criminal legal system in the world. We have the largest prison system in the world. We incarcerate the highest percentage of our population in the world. So our system is massive and unrivaled. And without plea bargaining, the whole system would grind to a halt.
It's interesting because I was reading, obviously this week, about this Crosley Green case.
I'm not familiar.
The guy from Florida who has been out for 2 years on a murder charge. His case was he was exonerated, and now they've appealed that exoneration, and he was sent back to prison. He surrendered on Monday in Florida, which was a lower. I'll read it here. He was released in 2021 after a U.S. District Court he had been wrongfully convicted, and then Florida's 11th Circuit, however, has overturned the ruling that let him out on parole.
That's happened to me as well in a couple of my cases. 20 years ago, if we won a habeas petition, everyone would just go in front of the judge and say, okay, it's over. But, as Led Zeppelin taught us in the 1970s, there's two paths you can go by. And the path that smart prosecutors have done is when we present a case, it's clear the person's innocent. They join us in a motion to dismiss the case, and we have a nice joint press conference, and everybody feels good about the right thing was done. The other path prosecutors have taken, and typically in California at least, it's been in a lot of small desert counties, is they fight us on our appeal. They fight us on the habeas petition. If we win, they appeal that decision. If they lose that, then they go back to trial and recharge them a second time around. And then what they'll do typically is they'll offer a time served deal. And then the clients are in this horrible position where they've been exonerated, but now they're facing a new trial. And with a new trial, they might get convicted again. And with one of my clients, they set a $2 million bail. So I had to sit down with this poor guy after we'd litigated his case for 15 years and say, they're going to try it again. I'm very confident we're going to win this retrial. But even if we win, you're going to be in jail for 6 months awaiting the new trial. And they've offered me a deal that you can walk out of here today. So guy's been in prison 18 years and he's got to be faced with, okay, now I got to take a deal to walk out of here. And it's really despicable, that strategy. And it's been adopted by some offices.
This show is brought to you by BetterHelp. So, hey, movers, as you guys all know my story about my trauma, my father murdered my mother when I was 11 years old. I witnessed it happen and I testified in court and put my father in prison. And that story comes with a lot of baggage. And even though I got through that trauma as a child, it didn't really start creeping back up to me until I was an adult. And it started manifesting itself in a lot of different ways where there was a lot of boundaries that I allowed others to cross. I got into bad relationships. You know the drill. But one of the things I found that really helped me was speaking to a trained professional. And I got the help that I needed. So if you guys are thinking about starting therapy, I cannot suggest a better resource than BetterHelp. So visit their website, go fill out their online questionnaire, and they'll get you matched up to a licensed therapist that can really help you move on to that next phase of your life. Visit BetterHelp.com/MPM to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/MPM. And why do they do that?
If you'd asked me 25 years ago, I'd have a different answer. I'd probably have a very angry answer that, they're all, it's disgusting and they're awful people and all that. I think people just get locked into their positions. I think when I show up in a town and say, that big murder trial you had that, you kind of built your career on, I think you're wrong. I think you got it wrong. And then everybody kind of locks in, and then they start rationalizing the weight of their behavior. I think it's no different than the human response to most things. I mean, people don't like you to come up to them at a barbecue and tell them how to flip a burger. And yet I'm coming in and telling prosecutors, you got your job wrong. Fundamentally, the most important thing that you do, you got wrong. And I think I've gotten better as I've gotten older in negotiating these cases, because there's a lot of psychology to that, to like, how do you let them off the hook for the wrongful conviction? How do you let them feel that they're not the one who made the mistake, that it was something else? Because it's not in my client's best interest that the prosecution's angry and wants to fight and keep fighting while my client sits in prison. So I think, life is a bell curve. There's a few people who are extraordinary at what they do. There's most of us that are good to okay. And then there's the awful and terrible. And I think sometimes people do fall in the awful and terrible, and I've got to deal with that. But I think most of the time people get up every day, they try to do the best they can in their jobs, but their egos can get in the way. And the psychology of it is very complex.
So you have to wear a lot of hats when trying to exonerate these people.
Oh yeah, it is not just lawyering in the traditional sense of I've got to understand habeas litigation and know how to write good briefs and know how to argue cases well. There's a media aspect to it because sometimes these narratives spin out of control in the media, and you've got to get a hold of that. There's negotiation, there's psychology, there's client management of their expectations and what you can do. And sometimes, getting clients to see, the best path for them is difficult. It takes a lot of different skills to do this kind of work.
We live in California, and California has a overcrowding problem in their prisons, right? Mm-hmm. And, I believe it was either during the COVID pandemic or towards the tail end of it when Gavin Newsom released, was it 20,000 people? I might be speaking out of turn, but it was something like that, right?
Yeah.
Well, and there's a lot of people that, that sit outside the state of California that pontificate on this, of course, in their own way. But when you see those things happen, and then you see people who are still incarcerated for crimes, let's say petty theft or drug possession in the 1970s that now would just be a misdemeanor at best. How do you sort of reconcile that?
Yeah, I mean, California, for a long time, we were the largest prison system in the United States. We've just dropped to number 2. Texas is now number 1. And there were a lot of different reasons for that. One was the reform of marijuana law, which decreased our, people who were in on simple possession charges. There was also some shifting of people to county custody, and we also reformed the 3 strikes law to make it consistent with what people thought it was. Whereas people thought, you had to have 3 serious or violent offenses, but didn't know that the 3rd offense could be basically nothing, shoplifting, very small things, and you can get life without parole for that. So we made some reforms to it. We have to be smarter about corrections, and we have to find ground that's in the middle between extreme positions, right? I mean, I'm a criminal defense attorney, but I've never proposed the notion that we didn't need to incarcerate people, that there's not some people we need to keep out of society and protect ourselves from. I've met some of those people in prison. I've spent time on death row. I've met with people who have done horrible murders. But the reality is the majority of people in prison are nonviolent. And the punishment of prison is the most uncreative way of dealing with crime. And it's uncreative because we've been doing it the same way for thousands of years. I mean, we literally say, okay, if you do this thing, you go to this place for this much time. And if you do this really bad thing, you go to the same place for a longer period of time. There's no way that that's a utilitarian approach that's good for society ultimately. And there's so much politics involved in the criminal legal system that you just know it's a mess. I mean, I'll give you an example. When every time there's a new hot topic, legislators love to get up and scream and yell about them and make new laws. So for instance, I remember when carjacking became a thing. And there was this horrible case in Maryland where this guy tried to, steal this car, and there was a baby in the car, and dragged the woman out and took the car, and everybody was shocked by it. So around the country, shortly thereafter, all the legislatures started making carjacking laws. And I was living in Michigan at the time, and Michigan passed a law which basically made it that if you went up to somebody and said, "I'm going to beat you up if you don't give me your car," you did twice the sentence of if I walked up to you and put a gun in your mouth and took $100,000 off you. So there was no connection to the level of violence, the amount of money that was taken. There's no connection to reality. It was just that was a hot topic. So it doesn't make any sense to say, if I take your $1,000 car and threaten you for it, that's now 20 years in prison. Yet an armed robbery is 8 years in prison. But that's what was happening. So we have a real problem in that politicians are way too deeply involved in the criminal legal system. And they learned a long time ago that using the politics of fear is a great way to get elected. And so a lot of laws get passed that just don't make sense. So it's kind of like everything in this country. We can't talk about guns because it's got to be either you love guns or you hate guns. So we can't talk about sensible gun policy. And that's what we've become. We're a very bifurcated country, and politicians really feed off that because they can kind of feed both sides of a debate and get votes off it. But in the end, we don't have very good policy. So, in terms of freeing people from prison, we need to free a lot of people from prison. And we also need to look at our laws and say, for what things does it make sense to put people in this thing we call prison? Or are there alternatives to that can still protect society, that can maybe make this person into a better person so they won't commit future crimes, and just have a more utilitarian approach to it? Until we do that, we're going to continue to be the country that locks up more people than anyone else. And that just makes no sense if you think about it, that the richest country in the world locks up the highest percentage of its population when there's a direct relationship between poverty and crime. We should not be in the top of that list at all. We're a rich country. We can afford to do other things and be more creative than just locking people up, then giving them criminal records, and then they come out and then they offend again because we're not doing a very good job in those prisons.
And do you think that when they come out and they reoffend again, it's because of a lack of opportunity that is presented to them or not presented to them, that you like you just said, you get released from prison, you have no rental history, you have a criminal record, you have no job history, and then you're like, but I want to live the straight and narrow, but the deck is stacked against you.
Yeah, we've made it harder to live a crime-free life. So you were already somebody committing crimes, and then we take you and put you in a place where we're not creating a situation where you're likely to decrease your criminal behavior, right? Yeah. And it's like, and on top of that, by the way, there's more subtle things, like in California and around the country, we would build prisons in remote areas. And in those remote areas, it's very hard for families to come and visit people in prison. And, you'll hear people say, well, why should they have family visits? We're punishing them. Yeah. Well, what we're really doing is we're now punishing their families, yes. We're disconnecting them from their families. We know that children of incarcerated people have the highest percentage of also becoming incarcerated people. Yeah. So we're kind of creating a new generation of people who are going to commit crimes. And then when they're disconnected from their families, they can't reinsert themselves in those families when they get out because that relationship has fallen apart. And all these things conspire to make them more likely to commit crimes again. And it's all because, we have this sort of rabid belief that punishment is the ultimate objective. But we can punish people while also making them more likely to succeed. I mean, we attempt to do that with our children every day, right? We don't punish our children in a way that's going to ruin their future. We don't go like, you didn't clean the bathroom, so I'm not going to drive you to your SAT. So you're not going to get into college now. Like we don't intentionally do those kinds of things as parents, and we should be more thoughtful as a government as to doing things that are in all of our benefit in our criminal legal system.
There's a lot to unpack in that whole few minutes right there, because I go back to, yeah, as you know, my father is incarcerated rightfully for murdering my mother, which I witnessed, and, testified against him and put him in prison. But, well, he put himself in prison, but, for all intents and purpose, I was the witness. But one of the things that I noticed over the years of visiting him, well, I was remanded to the state, so in the foster care system. And a lot of my peers in that foster care system, or that in that adoption system, or the system in general, had, obviously a parental figure, mostly a father, that was incarcerated. And again, they already have that lack of an example, a family example leading them, the father figure that they need in their life. And then you have this flip side where they can't have that family connection because they have to go to these, like you said, these remote areas. And especially here in California, these prisons are in the middle of nowhere. I mean, they are just like in Palmdale and stuff like, if you're in LA County or if you're in San Francisco, I mean, it's insane. It's hours and hours of driving. But
I can get to Bolivia quicker than Pelican Bay.
Exactly.
Right up on the northern border. It is not near anything. It's not near an airport, nothing.
Yeah. And I would go and visit my father in prison. And I've always said that I've spent probably at least a year of my life in prison for someone who has never been a part of the legal system, never been a lawyer, never just as a civilian, because I've actually been inside the actual prison that my father is incarcerated at many, many times. And not only the visitation room, and seeing the workings of all of this. And I just even remember my father writing me letters saying what you were sort of alluding to is it's college for criminals. You figure if somebody goes to prison for, petty theft or whatever, and then they come out and now they know how to steal a car. Now they know how to steal this. They know how to rob a bank. They know, because they've learned from people inside, because you're around a system of people who are, let's say they didn't get away. None of them got away with it, right? So they're all comparing notes on what did you do wrong? What did you do wrong? And that's the education system that's presented to these people, instead of learn trade skill, learn things that are going to make you a productive member of society. And how do you in your work even combat that?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what can we do in terms of assisting our clients when they get out and don't have those skills?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I represent innocent people in my current, role for the last 25 years. And innocent people don't do good time at all because, when you're guilty and you're in prison, you can at some point reconcile in your brain while you're there. And a lot of people, if we're honest about it and they're honest about it, they probably did a lot of crimes before the one they got caught for.
Sure, of course.
Right. So it's kind of like, okay, you got me at a certain point, and now I'm going to do my time as best I can. Yeah. But when you're innocent in prison, it's a surrealistic nightmare because you don't belong there. And so they do not adjust well to prison. And so I've been fortunate that a lot of my clients, and these are the ones obviously who survived the experience, they did at some point come to, I'm going to fight this case as hard as I can, but I'm going to make the best out of this situation at the same time. So for example, my client, Brian Banks, who's probably, my most famous client because he played in the NFL after we got him exonerated, he, shouldn't have been there. And he ended up getting a 6-year prison sentence. And at first he was fighting everybody. He wasn't eating. He wasn't participating in any program. He was just angry. And then he told me, one night he's just lying in his cell thinking, what's the point of me being angry? I'm only destroying myself. Nobody even cares. Nobody even knows. And he decided, I'm now going to spend every day in here improving myself and improving my situation for the end of this. And he started reading endless books. He actually lived with my family for a while, and my wife went out to a quiz night with him, and he knew the answers to all the questions, and he hadn't graduated high school. So, there's some people who have that sort of awakening in prison that I got to make the best out of this situation. Unfortunately, I've had a lot of clients who've done that and have done well when they've gotten out. But I know, to be honest, I'm not hearing probably from the guys who didn't get there. You know, some people end up basically committing suicide in prison by fighting or disconnecting. And it's super sad. And so, yeah, you know, but when Brian got out, he's an example too of how difficult we make it to get better. I mean, he's convicted as a 16-year-old kid of raping a classmate, goes off to prison for it. And she admits later on that never happened. You know, after he gets out of prison, she actually approached him on Facebook and said, you know, can we let bygones be bygones? So he was a totally innocent person, and she admitted it never happened. But an interesting thing he used to talk about when I would do presentations with him was he said, these people all thought that I had raped this girl. I get sent to prison. I don't get a minute of counseling. There's no one who deals with this alleged problem I have. Then I get out and I'm a convicted sex offender. There's still nothing like that. And the thing they do is put an ankle monitor on me and then make me report to a parole officer. But there's nothing that they're doing. If I was a person who's a sex offender, that's stopping me from offending again. And in fact, all these things would just make me angrier and frustrated and less likely to get employed, because now he's a convicted sex offender. And so it's, again, that's an example of how we really shoot ourselves in the foot.
Yeah.
While we think we're doing, I don't know. And it's, again, because we get so caught up in the punitive aspects of it that we don't stop to think like, wait a minute, is this good for all of us, what we're doing here? And rape is a crime of violence. A lot of studies show it's not about sexual gratification. So the idea of making violent people angrier and less functional is not productive in terms of actually addressing the real problem. And if we have the resources to just lock everybody up for the rest of their lives, then okay. Just take everybody and lock them up for the rest of their lives. And then you can say, okay, now we don't have a problem anymore. But that's just not reality. We don't even, we already spend more money than anyone else on this. And we're already cripple our education system by shifting money to corrections. And we got to let people out at some point. So we got to really think about that.
Yeah, one of the audience members was asking how our system of locking people up. I haven't interviewed with Tara Newell, who I met you through. We do our podcast Survivor Squad, which is coming out very soon. We interviewed Amanda Knox, who was obviously, locked up in an Italian prison for 4 years, and then exonerated, then retried, then just a nightmare. How does our system compare to those types of systems outside of the country?
Yeah, Amanda is an interesting one. I actually just spent the weekend with Amanda. We were at a conference together of all the exonerated people and all the lawyers who do the work. So I was in Phoenix with her and 1,000 other people who do this stuff. And Amanda, I actually learned a lot about the Italian system through Amanda, because I actually returned to Italy with Amanda on her first trip back there. And we both spoke at the same conference where she kind of confronted her DA and her case. Italy has an interesting thing where if you can actually opt to not put on a defense, and if you then get convicted, you get half a sentence. So in other words, the prosecution just puts their case on, you don't say anything, and then if you get convicted, you get half sentence. If you put your defense on and get convicted, then you get the full sentence. So that's an interesting thing. I don't really think it's necessarily a good idea, but it's interesting, this sort of, again, casino approach to criminal justice of like, okay, make a decision here. Do you want to make a defense? Because if you do, we're going to double up your sentence. But when you look at overall, criminal legal systems, we're not the worst. I work all over Latin America. I've started 35 innocence organizations in Latin America. I spend right now about a third of my time training Mexican lawyers how to do cross-examination, because Mexico just started having trials.
Yeah, you said that. I want to talk about that in a second.
Yeah. So we're not the worst. I see a lot of terrible stuff in Latin America, but we're nowhere near the best. They do a much better job in Europe, from their procedures that they enact during trial to their penalty phase and how they approach corrections. If you look at Northern Europe, their success rate, and you got to find, how do we measure success? Well, I think the best way to measure success is how many people return to prison after going there. Because if the point of prison was to make a change, the systems that the people aren't coming back into are doing a better job. And they have very low recidivism rates because they just have a philosophy of, and by the way, it's interesting, like in Sweden and the Scandinavian countries, they don't have parole. They just say, look, you're getting 10 years. For 10 years, you're going to be out of society. But for those 10 years, we're going to try and make you into a better person. And I think philosophically, if you start with that approach of like, you are going to prison, we are taking you out of society. So this isn't like we're going to be soft on you and not do anything about your bad behavior. We are. But we're going to focus on making you better psychologically, more likely to get a job, more likely to continue your education, more likely to be a law-abiding citizen. And they have very low recidivism rates. So we have one of the highest in the world. We have, last time I checked, it was something like 60 to 70% of people go back within 3 years. That's a failed system. So yeah, I think we have some of the better constitutional rights, we have some of the better trial rights. But as we talked about right in the beginning, almost nobody goes to trial. So all that stuff you see on TV of like, oh, you have this amazing, right to a jury, right to cross-examination, right to a lawyer. Well, that doesn't really amount to much if most of the cases are pled out because they don't have that process. That process doesn't exist for them. So it's hard to compare things exactly, but I do have the perspective that I've worked all over the world. I work in Europe in the summer often. I work in Latin America all the time, and I've worked in the United States for 33 years. This system.
Now, you were mentioning your client, Mr. Banks, earlier, but violent encounters in prison. And I would wonder if you were an innocent person in prison and you found yourself in a confrontation and then you had to defend yourself. And can you imagine being an innocent person in prison that then ended up taking someone's life because they attacked you? And has that ever worked out?
So I have a very crazy case with that, where I have a client, Reggie Cole, and he was wrongfully convicted. And while he was in prison,
now see what I was doing there was I was leading you, right?
Yeah, that's what you're doing. And he ends up getting in a confrontation where a guy called the Devil decides it's time for Reggie to die because he refused to follow orders from a gang leader. And so Reggie instead ends up killing the Devil, and he then gets pulled out of prison and put up for the death penalty. Because in California, if you're in prison for a homicide and you kill someone in prison, then that's a death case. His case was tried in a desert county where the prison is, because you're tried in the county where that crime happened. So it wasn't in Los Angeles where his original crime happened. It was out in a desert county where the prison was. And a friend of mine was assigned to represent him, this amazing lawyer who's now a judge called Christopher Plord. And Chris calls me and says, you know what, I think this guy's innocent of the crime he's originally in prison for. And we start looking into it, and there ends up that there was a book written by an LA Times reporter that was embedded with the homicide detective investigating our client's case. And there's all kinds of stuff in the book that was never disclosed to the defense that made it pretty clear that our guy was innocent. So we asked the judge to suspend the death penalty trial while we have a hearing on whether they can use the prior crime as an aggravating circumstances to make it a death penalty case. And the judge says, okay. So we have the hearing. We bring the guy who wrote the book in. We put all this stuff on evidence. And at the end of it, the judge says, you can't use the prior. I got a lot of questions about it. It doesn't seem legitimate. So now the prosecution's stuck with, okay, now I got a prison stabbing. There's no prior. Let's make a deal. And we make a deal for 7 years. But the prosecutor's thinking, what difference does it make? He's already serving a life sentence, and this judge has no authority to reverse that. So then our client goes back to prison, and we go to LA. We file the transcript from that hearing along with a habeas. We get the original conviction reversed. He'd already done more than 7 years, and now we're walking him out of prison. So literally, if he hadn't stabbed the guy in prison, he would have never gone back to court. He would have died in prison under his life sentence It was as wild a procedural case I've ever dealt with. And in fact, they were so angry that they realized, wait a minute, this guy's getting out now, that then they charged him with possession of a razor blade from 3 years before. We end up having a trial on that. But of course, they have no records of which cell it came out of, which mattress it came out of. It was one of these Department of Corrections, just sloppy investigations. Yeah. So we get that case dismissed. And now our client is out and living his life in Los Angeles.
That's wild.
Yeah, it really, even after doing this work for 33 years, that one, I was like, okay, this I've not seen before. A case that starts as a death penalty case ends up with an exoneration, a guy walking out, and there were 2 homicide charges that were totally unrelated.
And it's interesting because I don't think a lot of people, well, I mean, why would they? When you go to prison, you're pretty much forced to take a side.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's very difficult to survive in prison without having people around you to protect you. And it's interesting how it breaks down in prison too. It is just like the movies, and I know you know this because you spent a lot of time going into prison. It breaks down typically on racial lines.
Yeah. And
then it's about where you're from in terms of what city you're going to be from in California, and then the different, obviously, gang affiliations. And that's why, some of our clients who are just middle-class white folks who go to prison, I mean, the groups you got to affiliate to survive in prison that way are not the most pleasant groups to be hanging out with. So if you're not a white supremacist and you go to prison, there's some survival techniques. I have my own personal one that if it ever happens to me, and of course I've got to accept that. When I wrote this book, you might go to prison even though you're innocent. I had to accept that could happen to me someday too. And I've always had a strategy in my mind that the first day I go out on the yard and I get all the gang leaders together and I say, I'm going to be your lawyer and your lawyer and your lawyer and keep all these other dudes off me. And I'll be in the law library every day working for you. But yeah, it's tough. I mean, I've had clients in there who are, white middle-class guys who get convicted of rape or baby death cases wrongfully, and they are at the lowest level of the prison hierarchy. And so they often have to lock themselves up in protective custody the whole time they're in. And they often have severe mental issues as a result of that, PTSD. It's one of my clients spent 20 years in protective custody because he was convicted of murdering his girlfriend's baby that we ultimately proved the baby had fallen off the couch. And when I got him out, he couldn't cross the street without me holding his hand because he had just been locked in this very small cell and he'd literally lost his ability to kind of deal with fast moving objects. And he had spatial disorders about distances. And we lead, another thing we lead the world in, which most people don't know, is the United States leads the world in solitary confinement.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's anyone who's been through it, and I haven't, but I've certainly had a lot of clients who have. I mean, this is literally, you're breaking people down mentally. It's not a great idea to do that to people and then let them out of prison later. And if the thought is they're going to get out and you're keeping them in solitary confinement, that's not sound correctional philosophy.
It is 105 North Tower in the Bastille. That is for sure. It's I mean, I've watched a few documentaries on that and just even the perpetual cycle of keeping people in solitary, because then they act out in ways just to try to get some sort of contact, even if it's negative. The guards just rushing in and tackling them and whatever. And then of course then they give them another 5 years in solitary. And it's madness. It's descending into the abyss of madness.
It really is. It's yeah. And it's so when I see it on my clients' faces, because sometimes they get locked down for 30 days and then I go out and see them after it. And I'm like, oh God, this person was already not doing well. And now, what are we doing here? And it's always something stupid. We have people who work, it's again, the bell curve. We have correctional officers who are decent people just trying to do their job and take care of their families. But then there's other ones that are vindictive, that have, big egos, that love carrying a nightstick and having control over people. And I'm sure you, as a family visitor, saw what I see every time I go to prisons. You see these family members that are lining up in the desert, and these guys yelling at them as if they did something wrong. And there are some people who really shouldn't be in those jobs who are in them.
I remember my father had gotten transferred to Lucasville a year after, as we all know, what Lucasville is known for happened. And I just remember going into that place, and it was terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was still reeling from the violence and from the takeover that had happened. And for those of you that may or may not remember, may not have been alive, but Lucasville is a prison in Southern Ohio. It was taken over by the by the prisoners, because you have, and as we were discussing earlier, you have your sort of divisions in the prison population. You have, if you're African American or black, you are usually part of the Muslims. And if you are white, you're usually part of like the white supremacists or the Aryans. And those are warring factions, but they just decided to partner up together, and they took over the prison for, I believe it was 11 or 12 days.
Yeah.
And I think they killed several guards and the whole thing. And what was it? Bill Clinton was our president at the time. They had to send the National Guard in. It was a whole kerfuffle. But then that prison, it was terrifying for everyone involved. But I just remember going there it was it was very, very scary, and how they treated people. And yeah, you see it, because let's just face it, these are not people that are coming from, elite lifestyles, are coming in to visit their family members. This is, and they're probably taking their extra money that they have for whatever, just to put on these people's books. And then you go in and it costs $3 to load a card for $20 so you can use the vending machines in the rooms.
Yeah.
It's a racket.
It is a racket. I mean, and the worst one to me, the one that really has gotten me crazy for years, is the collect phone call racket.
Oh, yeah.
Nobody in society pays for collect phone calls except the families of incarcerated people and the lawyers like me that got to accept those calls. It's like, I can call India for free 7 different ways now. And yet these families, it just preys upon them because they're vulnerable and they have no choice, and nobody cares. Nobody cares outside the incarcerated families, because no one's aware of that. And, all the stuff to do with, putting money on the books and buying the little vending card. And you can only go to special, vendors when you want to buy something for someone who's incarcerated. Everybody's taking money off that. I mean, the whole thing is a gigantic business. And it's not just limited to private prisons. Like, I also get that all the time. People are like, are you in favor against private prisons? I was like, yeah, but don't stop thinking like that, because the whole thing is a business.
Yes.
The giant union, the Correctional Officers Union, that has a lot of power of lobbying. It's a massive industry to build these facilities. Regardless of whether they're private or public, there's still people making billions of dollars on building them. And then there's this just entire grotesque industry around things like that, like spending $3 on a plastic card so you can now put $1 on it and buy a soda. It's horrible when you see it up close. And you're in a unique position that most people, I'm in a unique position because I'm a lawyer who's been coming in and out of facilities for 33 years. But the percentage of people that have had your experience is ultimately very small in society. And particularly the people in your experience who are educated and have a voice, as you said, most of those people are poor, uneducated people who just put up with it and, talk to their friends about it, but they don't have a podcast. They don't, write for the New York Times. They don't, they're just not connected with a lot of people who are going to do anything about it.
Yeah, I remember there was I remember I caught my father it's called the JPay player or J player. It was an MP3, like a tablet thing, like an iPad, but it was their approved thing. And I remember I had sent money for him to get songs or music on the tablet, right, to be able to listen. Mm-hmm. And he said, yeah, I got this. And he sent me the catalog, and I'm like, $2.49 for a song? This is 79 cents on the iTunes store, and that's expensive.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it's just insanity, how these companies take advantage of this. And again, yeah, it's poor people that don't know the difference.
And you know, by the way, that now that we're seeing prison populations decline somewhat, with the drug law reforms and all that. So where has the industry moved? The industry has moved into immigration detention facilities. That's become the hot political topic of the last few years. I mean, we see the presidential election, there's caravans coming from the Honduras. This is the new group to be afraid of, are the immigrants. And now, there was an article I read in the New York Times about how the corrections industry was behind Arizona's law incarcerating undocumented people. And there's obviously a financial interest in having laws that lead people to go into these facilities, because those facilities have to be built, maintained, employed, and it's a giant, that could become just as large an industry as immigration detention facilities. And then you have, towns that open them and make contracts, because the U.S. Supreme Court said you have no constitutional right to be housed anywhere within the United States. There's a case called Olin versus Joaquin Acona that allows them to transfer incarcerated people from Hawaii to the mainland. And ever since that case came down, you can be transferred anywhere in the United States. So that then creates this then private industry of, well, let's build a prison in, some small town in Wisconsin, and we'll contract with these other states to take their incarcerated people. It's the most crazy industry out there, and it's not talked about hardly at all. It's not
discussed. I think because a lot of people are afraid of going to prison for speaking out. I mean, it's scary. It's absolutely terrifying. And it's as someone who's brought a camera into the prison system, I was allowed to do that. It is a very, and it's interesting. My father, where he is incarcerated, is in Marion Correctional Institution, which is recognized, I think, if not in the United States, in the world, as being the most progressive prison, because they have something like 70 or 80, which is how I was able to go inside, because I would, but they have 70 or 80 programs for their inmates. That's outside of non-secular, religious activities, right? Wood shop, machining. So they had a whole department where they would do creative work for the state of Ohio, the Department of Corrections in the state of Ohio, and they would build websites. They would do graphics design. They would make video content. They would make audio content. They ran what is called the PNN, the Prison News Network. So I had become, in pursuit of making my film, I had become friends with the person who ran that for the state of Ohio, who was a professor at Ohio State University. And I was able to go in and I would teach classes on how to edit. I would teach these inmates how to edit content, how to edit through Final Cut Pro and things like that, which was also like one arm tied behind your back, because they don't have the latest software, because they can't connect to the internet, so they can't get the updates and things like that. But I thought this is such a microcosm of, and I mean, Piper Kerman, I believe is her last name, from Orange is the New Black.
Yeah.
So she would go in there and teach writing to these inmates. Mm-hmm. It's wild. And I thought, what if, and there's violence in that prison, obviously, but it's like a medium security prison. But you thought, what if they just adopted this model in other prisons? Because it really is teaching people skills. And there are many programs that dealt with the recidivism, because they would release these people and they would release them with job skills, because I don't think the majority of people that go to prison want to go back to prison.
No. And I also started my career teaching in prison. I started in law school. I was teaching in a facility. And then my wife and I started the first prison family literacy program 30 some years ago.
Wow.
And the idea of that program was we were teaching the guys how to teach their children to read. And because it was in the District of Columbia, everybody who was incarcerated in DC back then was kept in this facility in Virginia, 20 miles away. So we were able to actually, on the weekends, round all the kids up in buses. We'd bring them to the prison. We had in the prison school, we had a really nice setup where we had books and toys, and we'd have the guys in there teaching their children how to read. And the whole idea of it was to try break down the cycle of illiteracy in these families and to, keep that connection strong between the fathers and their children. Because as I said, that the breakdown of those relationships is a large part of why people, I used to always say, like, these guys can save their kids and these kids can save these guys. They need to have something to go home to. And then what we do is give each child a stack of books, and we'd have the fathers recording themselves reading the books. So at night, these kids could be lying on their bed, flipping through the pages, listening to their father's voice reading to them. And it was the most simple, basic, beautiful program I'd ever been a part of. And then, of course, they closed down the DC prison. They ship everybody all over the country, and the DC became the worst place in the country to do it. And it was, again, just not thinking of if we'd kept people close to home. And that's, by the way, what I see in Latin America. In Mexico particularly, they incarcerate people locally, and you see families coming and going all day long in and out of the facilities. And that's something you don't see here. There's, special visiting days. It's very strict. It's limited in time. It's in the middle of the desert, and you get that disconnection.
And is that effective in Mexico?
Well, I mean, they have so many other problems. It's hard to know if anyone's measured it. I mean, it's also a necessity, by the way, because the conditions are so bad and they're not provided enough food. So people are kind of bringing food to their loved ones. Yeah. I'll say an interesting thing, though, on that is that about 25 years ago, I got a scholarship to go to England and research why in the United Kingdom they had so few prison riots, where we had so many in the United States, and what was the distinction between the two places. And when I went there, the fascinating thing was I found a lot of the facilities were a lot worse than the United States. They had these old Victorian, very cold, bad food. They even have a prison in Dartmoor that was built by the Romans that's still functions. So, I mean, these are like not great places in terms of conditions. And yet they weren't having riots. And what I came to the conclusion was a lot of it had to do with that the officers were coming from a lot of the same communities as the people who are incarcerated. Whereas here we take a lot of people from the inner city and we put them out in these rural prisons that are staffed by people from rural areas. And there's a lot of racial conflict actually between officers and staff. And just literally the structure of the facility in Britain was structured that the officers would be in the units all the time, interacting with the people who are incarcerated. And yet we have this perimeter security model that what we're only really concerned with is keeping them in there. And so because they were interacting all the time, they were on top of problems more. They were dealing with problems as they came up and conflicts. And in one prison, I'm walking through the facility with the warden, and this guy comes up and he says, excuse me, Governor, I've got a problem with one of the officers. I did this painting in the art class, and it's a painting of this Renaissance painting. And he pulls his painting out in his book, and I'm just thinking, is this like something set up for me?
Right.
The warden says, right, mate. So tomorrow we'll have the officer in my office. You can come in. We'll get your art teacher. We'll get this sorted out. And I'm sitting there thinking, if this was the United States, that guy might have been hit in the face with a nightstick already for approaching the warden on the yard like that. But it is this sort of different cultural thing in how they interact. And so even though here they talk about they're rioting over food, they're rioting over conditions and how cold the facilities are or hot they are, a lot of it has to do with just the human side of it, of how we run these facilities and how we interact within them. As to why a lot of these riots happen. So there's a lot. It's a lot deeper than most people think, and then most people just never see it or care about it. So we don't do such a good job with it.
Well, you get arrested. Somebody gets arrested, and you're trying to get like toilet paper or soap, and they don't care. That's just in a jail. Let alone in prison. And it is this sort of they. And I bring this up because I get a lot of comments on videos or on podcasts that I do when I talk about having compassion for inmates, and a lot of people are like, they're in there because they deserve it, and then this, that, and that's a bit like, that thought process is very anachronistic, because we have to, because we can't keep these people locked away forever. We can't lock them away and throw away the key, as you were saying earlier. They're going to have to get out at some point. And wouldn't you rather have people that are going to come back and re-enter a society, that can re-enter a society and contribute to that society, versus detract from it or just re-offend and go right back to where they were? And they also want that too. I mean, there are some people that, of course, never will be reformed. My father will never be reformed. My father's a psychopath. You know what I mean? I think my father, many people have said, your father wants to kill you. So as soon as he gets out, that's who he's coming for. But I think that that aside, I think that that would be the exception, not the rule.
I so appreciate that you can see that, because it's hard
Sure.
to be someone in your situation and not paint with a broad brush. And you're right. I've come across people. I mean, I sat with a guy named Angel Resendez on death row in Texas, and this guy's killed so many people, and he is just wired wrong. I mean, he's a pure sociopath, no bravado, no shame about the stuff he's done, just talks about killing people like, he's talking about places he's visited. And there are people like that, but they are a very small percentage of the correctional population. And we could do a better job of focusing on violent offenders if we could start thinking of these people as different, as violent. There's violent and there's nonviolent. And if we start with those two categories and we have a different philosophy and approach to it, then we'll do a better job for everybody. And maybe some people will be held in longer as a result of that too. I mean, that's the other part of it. It's like, like you said earlier, people sometimes get released from prison because of overcrowding and because a federal judge orders it. Well, if we were doing a better job of sorting through them earlier on, then we'd have a better sense of who we're putting in there and not have to later on make a horrible decision of going, we got to let this guy out who's violent because this other dude's serving a mandatory minimum on a drug charge. And that is a reality, because you can have mandatory minimums on drug charges and not mandatory minimums on violent offenses.
Yeah.
It's because it's not thought through in a logical way. It is just politicians playing games a lot of times, and they're just getting votes. And even if they're well-intentioned, they're not that well-informed. I mean, it's not like they have an education on that to become a state legislator. So for instance, in California, we don't have lawyers in our state house. We have people who get elected from their communities. There's no reason they would necessarily have any understanding of these issues. Yet they're the ones that make the law. And so a lot of times it just gets driven by politics. And in the end of it, we have, a bad situation because we didn't have the best people making those decisions with the best intentions.
How do you educate people like that?
Well, that's what we're doing now, right? That's the whole reason I wrote this book. That's why we're having this conversation. I just want people to be sensible about it. I think you can educate legislators, and we spend a lot of time doing it in California. We've had a number of laws passed. We've had Republican and Democratic support of our laws. We, for instance, to give you an example, one of the first laws we got passed was a preservation law that when people are in prison, you can't throw the evidence out from their case. And when I started in California, in about 70% of the rape cases I looked at, where DNA might have proven the person innocent, the rape kits were thrown out after the trial. And so you die in prison. The evidence is gone. There's no way to prove your innocence. And we got support on that. We then got support getting a DNA law passed to give people the right to get that testing done. A lot of people screamed and yelled and said it'll be too expensive. There'll be a flood of these cases. And there wasn't, because the only people who got that right were cases where a DNA result could prove innocence. And that's a very small percentage of cases where you can prove your innocence with DNA testing, especially since it's been done in trials since 1995 in California. We've got a law passed for compensating people who are wrongfully convicted, because so many people were getting out and then they're going on, services, and they're angry and they can't put their lives back together, and they're entitled to that. Like the government has done a wrong to them. And most of them can't file lawsuits because the people who did it to them have immunity. So we work with legislators a lot. And, I don't want to be all negative today. I think if you can take a 30,000 foot view, things are getting better, right? It's like everything in life. You take 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But if you can have a more global view of the last 30 years, things are getting better. It just, I think sometimes we focus, and I'm more guilty than anyone of this, of the bad thing I'm dealing with right now, but we can do a hell of a lot better. And particularly if we stop being a red and a blue country on many issues, because I'm 57 years old. When I was in college, I've been voted mostly Democrat most of my life. But when I was in college, I had a lot of friends who were Republicans who, just wanted to pay lower taxes. It wasn't a divide that was like the Grand Canyon. You were just sort of debating like, hey, should a little more money go into social services, and should taxes be lower or higher? These are you can have debates about them that are civil and academic. And Ronald Reagan and George Bush was in favor of increasing immigration and not having draconian policies with immigration. It's like that hasn't always been the line for the Republican Party, that we're anti-immigrant. But we've really locked into these positions. And this area, I think, is the worst part of it, is criminal law, gun control. I mean, when you poll the majority of Americans and ask them the questions, they do want legislation that changes access to weapons and changes background checks, even if they're in favor of the Second Amendment. Because one doesn't have to exist, they're not exclusive. It's like, every constitutional right has limits. We have a Fourth Amendment right to privacy, but the police can still come in my house if they have a warrant or a good reason. We have a First Amendment right to free speech, but we can't say anything we want anywhere. Every constitutional right has limits, and the Second Amendment is no different than those, but we can't even get into a conversation about it because it's either all or nothing. Yeah. And I think we've put ourselves in a weird place where people aren't talking to each other, and we're red hats and blue hats, and California is some ways the ultimate example of that. It's
absolutely. Absolutely. You go the farther north you go, and it's wild, man. It's wild.
The further you get from the water, along the coastline, except for Orange County, it's majority Democrats. And then you come away from the water and the farmlands, and it's really complex too with the immigration issues. It's so divisive, and politicians just really manipulate that.
They do.
It's like, that's why in San Diego is an interesting place, because we're right on the border. This is the most crossed border on the planet, is in San Diego County. Yet San Diego doesn't support these anti-immigration policies, because if you live in San Diego, you live among Mexicans and Hondurans and Central Americans every day. Yeah. You see that they're doing all the hardest jobs that anyone's doing. Most of them are family-oriented people who like to keep their head down and stay out of trouble. And you see it firsthand every day. So you can't be sold these lines from politicians that they're crossing the border and murdering people, because San Diego is one of the safest, nicest cities in the United States. And we're on the front line of this. So it just doesn't work here, that messaging, but it works all over the rest of the country that doesn't see this every day.
I remember coming, I had moved out here in 2000. I moved to Los Angeles in 2002, but I was in California starting in 2001. I remember going back home to Ohio, and somebody said, how do you deal with all that? And, all those illegal immigrants. This is 21 years ago. And how do you deal with these illegal immigrants and all these things? And people, they're taking your jobs. And I was like, yeah, because everyone wants to be selling bags of fruit on the corner with a little cart. I'm just like, what are you talking about? I was, I reminded people that, a lot of these people cross the border to come to work, and they're working to send money back home. Mm-hmm. They're here. They want to keep their head down. They're standing outside Home Depot at 6 a.m. because they want to help get labor to help build your house. And they're not there to commit crimes. It's not to say that all of them are like that, because you can pull, you can pluck up a sample population out of everything and say, here's all the bad people. Here's all the bad people. But I think it's just also saying like all humans are bad, or all red people are bad, all blue people are bad. It's like they're bad on both sides. You can find bad anywhere. You can find trouble anywhere you want to look.
Yeah, you can always find those examples, and And look, yeah, too, in California, for the first time in its history, has a shortage of bartenders. And a friend of mine who runs a restaurant said he's paying his dishwashers now $25 an hour because he can't get any of them. Like, there's a great documentary called A Day Without a Mexican.
Yes, I've seen that.
Yeah, and it's like our economy has thrived under immigration because we've let people come across the border. They work really hard. They don't get the benefits. They're not using the schools. And in fact, if you look back to the 90s and 80s, what was happening is people would cross over. They would work in the farms during the season, and then they would go home. But now what we've done by tightening up the border, we're actually keeping them here because now it's very difficult to cross back and forth. And you're like, okay, now I can't go home. And you have people that are up here for decades and they want to go home. I mean, Mexico is a beautiful country. I spend a lot of time there. There's a lot of beautiful things there. Now, if you're very poor, it's not a great life. But if you could have the situation that you were crossing over, working, and then going home to your family, nobody wants to live in another country from their family. But this is a situation we've kind of created. So it's another example, like we've been talking about prisons, where by not having a sensible solution, we've actually made things worse because it's so politicized. And every candidate from president, they won't have this conversation you and I are having. I mean, I was listening to Bernie Sanders talking about it in the campaign. He's talking about how we need to keep jobs here and we need to do these things. So it was Democrats and Republicans because it became a kind of untenable political stance to even appear like you were against American jobs. And, having a strong Mexico with a great economy is in all our best interest, just like it's in our best interest to not be locking up our population. Because if Mexico is stable and people have jobs and the economy is good, then they're not crossing the border. And now we're not spending trillions of dollars to secure a border. And they buy more of our stuff than almost any country in the world. And we export trillions of dollars of stuff to Mexico. So if you're in a small town in Mexico and you've got a good job, you are supporting the U.S. economy. You're buying U.S. goods. You're shopping at Home Depot. You're going to McDonald's. You're doing all these things that consumers do. But it really you can't explain that in a TV commercial. In a TV commercial, you just say, build a wall. And everyone says, okay, build a wall. It's not.
I mean, I don't want to get into a geopolitical debate, but I think also the other thing that is overlooked is that there's skilled labor there that is south of the United States that is able to make cheap products. And it's skilled labor in technology. And what does that mean? That means that we don't have to go on the other side of the ocean
to China
because there are many studies that come out that say that labor is cheap. The technical labor is cheaper in Mexico, and it's also twice as effective. Yeah. And you don't have to. So if you have an issue, this is how you solve this problem. You go to Latin America, which is why you see all these shifting sort of sands in the geopolitical climate, right?
Oh, yeah. And if you look at what's happened with China in the last few years and the feelings towards China and China then cutting us off from microchips and China expanding its reach, China's been able to build its economy while shipping all those goods across the Pacific. Mexico sits there on our border with a huge working class with all the capacity. And because of a number of factors, haven't been able to build up their economy in the same way. They've had to deal with a war on drugs. They've had to deal with a whole lot of things, and centralized government in Mexico City, and there's a lot of corruption and a horrible police force. And it's really sad because every time I spend a lot of time in Mexico, and you look at it, and they have every resource a country could have. They've got oil, they've got agriculture, they've got coastline. They're not involved in any wars, except the drug war. Yeah. And they're placed in a location that's the most envious location you could be, on the border with the biggest consuming country in the history of the world, and haven't been able to pull themselves out, while China's built their entire economy by supplying Walmart from across the ocean. And T-shirts cost the same now that I was buying them for in 1984 because they tied their currency to our currency. But we are way far afield on criminal justice. I love it. But.
We are absolutely. But you were saying that you're doing work in Mexico because they are now enacting a trial system. So that was something that we discussed very briefly the other day. But tell me a little bit about that, because I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, so Mexico has never had trials. What they've had is people would file paperwork. The prosecution would file their paperwork. The defense would file some paperwork. Judges would look at it and make decisions. And a lot of times they would look at it with the prosecution and sit down with the prosecutor and decide what the sentence was going to be. There was no transparency. There were no oral trials like we know in the United States. And about 8 years ago, Mexico started having trials. But the problem is most people don't know how to do them, most lawyers. The United States has 200 law schools. Mexico has more than 2,000 law schools. And so I spend a huge amount of my time down there, both training law students and lawyers how to do trials. I'm head of Mexico's National Moot Court Program, where I actually put on moot court competitions between universities to help teach them how to do trials and integrate it into their curriculum. Because the only way to have a good legal system is to have transparency and, the opportunity. I mean, just think, Mexico has the second most corrupt police force in the world, and you were never able to cross-examine a police officer. So when they issue a police report, it was fact, and there was no way of challenging it. And that the level of corruption that comes from that, when they know they're untouchable, makes the system not work. And it's very important to have a strong rule of law to have the other stuff we're talking about, economic success. And if you look from World War II until now, why has the US dollar been the strongest economy, strongest currency in the world? It's because people have confidence about investing in the US. Because when you build a factory here, if people cheat you, you can go to court and sue them, and you can enforce contracts. And people aren't thinking like, oh, I'm going to build a factory and the government's just going to take it from me. So the U.S. has a very strong rule of law, and that leads to a strong economy because that leads to investment. And that's been a problem in Latin America is they have a weak judicial system. And so you don't have confidence in investing there, and you don't have safety in investing there. And that leads to very weak economies, as well as all the other problems that come with that of poverty, crime, unstable governments. And I trained the first 12 public defenders in Chile 3 decades ago after Pinochet.
Yeah.
And now, Chile has one of the best criminal legal systems in Latin America. And a lot of that is because people lost complete faith in the government and wanted to reform the whole thing. And so they were open to a new transparent system where police officers couldn't do undercover investigation without notifying people, where there were regulations on the police that are really strict, because they went through a period of time where the police would show up at your house and pull you outside and shoot you in the head or put you in a concentration camp. And the U.S. has never gone through that. So we still have a level of confidence in our government that we're not looking for that kind of full, do-over and makeover. And we don't necessarily need it either, right? I think there are changes that can be made, but we don't need to dismantle the system. But it's fascinating working in Latin America because it gives me a totally different perspective on the United States and the rest of the world and what things work and what things don't.
Absolutely. It's all about shaping your perspective, right?
Exactly. Like your perspective to me is fascinating because you're someone who went through this horrific crime, and there's nothing worse than the crime you're talking about, having not a stranger, but a loved one killed you. The two closest people in your life and one kills the other one. I mean, that's as bad as it gets in the criminal system in terms of the psychology around that. And then you go through the whole experience of like, how do I have a relationship with this other person who's still alive, and what does that mean, and what and I don't know. Yeah, I don't have to tell you what you know.
It's very convoluted, and it is very difficult to not be myopic in your pattern of thought and how you see the world or how you see the criminal justice system. But yeah, I think it just all comes down to compassion, and it comes down to understanding that the exception versus the rule. And when you deal with people, and I think that was probably the biggest thing for me, is because my father is such a narcissist and a psychopath. and everything when you deal with these people is very transactional, right? But he was constantly engaged with the other inmates, not only because of his education level, but because he was trying to show good works to get out. So he would always have this engagement with these other inmates, whether it be in a church fellowship or he'd teach like Toastmasters and stuff like this, right? And so I would go to the visitation rooms and I would meet these people. These other inmates, I could be coming up to the vending machine and be like, I just want to tell you, Doc has been so good. They call him Doc in prison because he was a doctor. And Doc's been so instrumental in me. And I'm getting out in a couple of years and I've got a really good plan. And he's doing all these things. And it's very hard for me to say, because I would be like, oh, I'm so glad that he's been a positive influence on you. And then, but I always stop short of finishing the sentence. And he's only doing that because he's trying you're getting the advantage because he's trying to gain good works to put on a resume to get out of prison, probably so he can kill me for putting him in there, right? That's what I'm thinking in the back of my head. But it was interesting to get to know these people and their family. I don't know, I'm talking about like, black, white, Latino, people, all across that would come up to me in these visitation rooms and just talk to me and just getting to know their families over the years, and just because that's all they got is years, right? And it was fascinating, and it really does help you build a level of compassion to understand that not everybody here is some people are here because they made a mistake and they recognize that and they're going to move on, And how do we encourage those people to do the right thing and give them the opportunities?
Well, thank you for that, because it's sad so many people who don't have compassion, who didn't go through what you went through, and they're just sort of picking up their anger from watching television, watching news stations and getting riled up without even having like a horrible thing that happens to them as a result of a crime. And so, thank you for being somebody who went through the worst of it and still maintain the capacity to see everything for what it is. And that is true. Nothing's black and white in this world. It's all shades of gray. And, compassion is the key to just trying to put yourself in other people's shoes and see those things. It's very hard for most of us to do.
Yeah, it is. It's easier said than done, for sure. So Justin, where can we find your book? Where can we find you? Where can our audience reach out to you? Give us all the details.
Well, I'm on social media if you want to hear my rants on a daily basis on Twitter and Instagram, Facebook at Justin O. Brooks. And my book, you can buy it anywhere. It's at Amazon.com. It's in bookstores. It's on all the websites. And it's called You Might Go to Prison Even Though You're Innocent.
My guest today is Justin O. Brooks. He is the head of the California Innocence Project. Justin, thank you so much for being on the program. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it as well.
All right, movers. Thank you all so much for tuning in to today's program. Thank you to all my channel supporters, all my Patreon supporters for being on here. If you are interested in supporting this program, please, there are links up at the top of this. You can go to my website. You can go to callyourlandry.com/links. Leads you to my Patreon. You can subscribe here on the channel. Like and subscribe, please do that. But you can also become a channel member. All of your support helps support getting wonderful guests like Justin and my other guests this week. Next week, I will be speaking with Roberta Blevins, who is, if you guys have seen the Amazon documentary Lula Rich, it is about her time working with the MLM company LuLaRoe. She's going to talk to us about her experience in that company, but also the work that she's doing having left that, and the culty side of MLMs and the work that she's doing after getting out of that cult. So for now, I'm Collier Landry, and this is Moving Past Trauma. Thanks, y'all. This podcast is made possible by support from listeners just like you. For exclusive content around this podcast, please consider supporting me via Patreon by going to collierlandry.com/support. Please subscribe via Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from, and please leave us a 5-star review. If you want to see video episodes of this podcast, please check out my YouTube channel at youtube.com/collierlandry. You can find links to additional resources in the show notes of today's episode. This podcast is a production of Don't Touch My Radio. Copyright Collier Landry.